The story of Lucky Luciano's life after power begins not with the swagger of a man commanding the streets, but with a profound silence. A silence that carries the weight of lost control, of an empire slipping from his grasp. Once, the mere mention of his name inspired both fear and respect, a combination that forged him into the undisputed architect of organized crime in America. New York's underworld had danced to his rhythm, from the glittering speakeasies of Manhattan to the shadowed docks where illicit goods changed hands under the cover of night. He had built not just alliances but systems, a network that functioned like a meticulously organized machine, each cog essential, each move calculated. He had reshaped the Mafia, turning rival gangs into partners, enemies into predictable elements of a grand strategy, and street-level chaos into an empire governed by rules and profit. But as with every empire, there comes a moment when even the most powerful figures are confronted by the limits of their control. Exile, the bitter and unfamiliar companion, crept into Luciano's life not as a sudden blow but as a gradual erosion of influence. The streets that once whispered his name now murmured with the anticipation of change, the inevitability of transition. Arrest, trial, and imprisonment had stripped him of the physical freedom to enforce his will, but more devastating was the slow unraveling of authority, the creeping sense that time and circumstance could not be commanded. Power, he realized, was a fragile illusion, one that required constant vigilance, fear management, and the subtle manipulation of loyalty. Without the daily rituals of dominance, without the immediate presence of men sworn to obey, even a genius strategist like Luciano was forced to confront the vulnerability inherent in his human form. Yet even in exile, the story of Lucky Luciano is not one of mere defeat. It is a study in the resilience of intellect and ambition. Stripped of his throne, he was left with his mind, and in that mind still burned the sparks of calculation, observation, and adaptation. The streets of New York were gone, but the network of relationships, the alliances, debts, and enmities, remained, stretching across oceans, waiting for a man capable of navigating them even from a distance. The challenge of exile, then, was not simply survival. It was the reassertion of influence in a world that had moved on without him. In this strange liminality, he confronted a different kind of power, one that demanded patience, diplomacy, and a deep understanding of human psychology, for control could no longer be asserted through fear alone. In many ways, Luciano's exile is a mirror of the human condition itself. It is the tension between ambition and limitation, between the desire to dominate and the inevitability of circumstance. For a man who had thrived on action, unpredictability, and decisive control, this new reality was both cruel and instructive. It forced him to observe, to calculate, to understand the subtleties of influence that could operate invisibly, through suggestion and reputation rather than through direct action. In this quiet space, he learned the power of patience, the art of waiting for the right moment, and the subtle ways in which even distance could be converted into leverage. Every letter sent, every conversation manipulated, and every rumor sown became a tool in a continuing struggle to assert relevance, to maintain the shadow of authority that had once been palpable on the streets of New York. The psychological landscape of exile was complex, fraught with tension between nostalgia and adaptation. Luciano was haunted by memories of the empire he had built, the streets he had controlled, and the men whose loyalty he had commanded. Yet, he was also forced to inhabit a world in which he was a stranger, a man recognized but not revered, a strategist without a battlefield. The isolation was not just geographical but social and emotional, challenging the very identity that had been forged in the crucible of power and violence. It demanded reflection, adaptation, and a recalibration of self-worth independent of external validation. In this sense, the exile was both punishment and opportunity, a forced retreat that allowed the man to observe himself, his past, and the fragile architecture of the empire he had created. To begin the story is to enter a world of contrasts. The brilliant strategist reduced to a spectator, the legendary Don confronted by the limits of human agency, and the man whose influence once seemed absolute now navigating a reality where every action required careful calculation. It is a story that moves beyond simple biography, into the realms of psychology, morality, and the human fascination with power and its loss. Here, in this quiet exile, the lessons of loyalty, betrayal, ambition, and resilience are written not in the violent actions of the streets, but in the subtle, invisible maneuvers of a mind that refuses to surrender entirely to circumstance. Even as the world moves on without him, Luciano remains a figure of immense presence, a man defined as much by his ability to adapt as by the empire he once commanded. It is in this paradox, power without territory, influence without immediacy, that the story of the Exile King truly begins. Even at the height of his power, Lucky Luciano's empire was a fragile architecture of fear, ambition, and meticulous planning. To understand his life in exile, one must first grasp the magnitude of what he once commanded: the sprawling underworld of New York City and beyond, a complex network of operations that moved in silence yet shaped entire communities. At its peak, his influence stretched from the docks where shipments disappeared into the night, to the back rooms of opulent nightclubs where deals worth millions were struck under the soft glow of chandeliers. Luciano had transformed a chaotic criminal landscape into an organized, hierarchical system where every participant knew their role and the consequences of overstepping it. Rival gangs were no longer anarchic threats but structured elements in a larger strategy, a chessboard where every move was calculated with precision and foresight. The streets that had once been ruled by violence and uncertainty now moved to a rhythm dictated by Luciano's vision. Every crime, every transaction, was orchestrated to maximize profit and minimize risk. He was a man who understood the psychology of power, manipulating fear and respect in equal measure. Loyalty was not merely expected. It was engineered through carefully calibrated incentives, subtle threats, and the unspoken knowledge that betrayal could be fatal. Those who once plotted against him often found themselves absorbed into his network, either as collaborators or as cautionary examples. In this sense, his empire was not simply a collection of criminal enterprises, it was a living organism, evolving, adapting, and expanding under the stewardship of a man who saw both the world and human nature with unparalleled clarity. Yet, the brilliance of Luciano's empire was matched by its volatility. Every alliance carried the risk of betrayal, every success carried the weight of enemies lurking in the shadows. His power was absolute only as long as the delicate balance of fear, loyalty, and strategic advantage was maintained. This is what made his fall so profound. The same mechanisms that had built his empire could not shield him indefinitely from the forces that would eventually strip him of authority. Arrests, legal maneuvering, and the slow erosion of control revealed the underlying fragility of even the most meticulously constructed dominion. His empire, vast and intimidating as it was, depended on his presence, his vision, and his ability to navigate the intricate web of human ambition and insecurity. Luciano's brilliance was not limited to brute force or intimidation. He understood that the true power of an empire lies in its structure and systems. He modernized organized crime, introducing innovations that transformed how illegal enterprises operated. Gambling, prostitution, bootlegging, and union racketeering were no longer isolated activities but integrated operations designed to maximize revenue and minimize exposure to law enforcement. By turning rivalry into cooperation, he reduced violent competition and increased predictability, a revolutionary approach in an era when mob wars had decimated entire neighborhoods. This systematization required foresight, patience, and a deep understanding of the human psyche. Luciano was not just a criminal. He was a strategist, a visionary who saw opportunity where others saw chaos. And yet, even in his greatest triumphs, the seeds of vulnerability were present. Power is inherently unstable, and absolute authority can never exist without constant vigilance. Rival factions, jealous lieutenants, and law enforcement scrutiny were persistent pressures that demanded careful management. The very structure that made his empire formidable also made it dependent on his presence. Without the calculated orchestration of his mind and the direct enforcement of his will, the network he had built risked unraveling. This precariousness would become painfully evident when legal intervention and betrayal intersected, setting the stage for a downfall that was as dramatic as his rise. The contrast between his empire at its height and his life in exile is stark. Where once he moved freely through New York's labyrinth of crime, issuing orders that shaped destinies, he would later inhabit a world of observation and negotiation, where influence had to be exerted without the immediate leverage of presence. To truly understand the magnitude of his exile, one must see the empire in its full scope, the alliances that formed the backbone of his authority, the psychological acumen that secured loyalty, and the relentless drive that converted chaos into order. It was an empire that existed not only in buildings, money, and weapons, but in the minds of those who recognized his authority, obeyed his rules, and feared his wrath. Luciano's empire also represented the cultural and social shifts of America during the early 20th century. Immigrant communities, especially Italian and Jewish neighborhoods, found both opportunity and oppression within the criminal networks he controlled. He leveraged social structures, ethnic loyalty, and the marginalization of these communities to consolidate power, embedding himself as both a protector and a predator. His influence went beyond the criminal underworld. It touched politics, labor unions, and legitimate businesses. He understood that real power extended beyond fear. It required integration into the very fabric of society, making his authority simultaneously visible and insidious. This combination of strategic genius, social manipulation, and operational control makes the fall of Luciano all the more compelling. In Exile, the lessons of this empire would shape his approach to power without presence. He would rely on his understanding of human behavior, reputation, and strategic patience to maintain influence across continents. The contrast between what he once controlled and what he would struggle to navigate in Italy is central to understanding his post-empire life. The streets of New York, once his domain, had moved on. Yet the principles that had built his empire, structure, psychology, and adaptability, remained intact in his mind, ready to be applied to the uncertain landscapes of exile and observation. By examining the empire that was, we not only measure the scale of his power but also the stakes of his exile. Luciano was not merely a criminal. He was an architect of an entire system of control, a man whose intelligence and vision created structures that outlasted him, even as his personal freedom was stripped away. To see his life after power is to see a brilliant strategist confronted by a world that no longer bends to his will, a man whose mastery of chaos is tested by distance, isolation, and the relentless passage of time. It is the story of a Don at the peak of influence, whose greatest challenge would soon become survival in a world that no longer acknowledges his dominance. The arrest of Lucky Luciano was not merely a legal procedure. It was a seismic event that sent shockwaves through the entire underworld. 4 years he had moved with calculated precision, orchestrating alliances, settling disputes, and consolidating power in a way that left rivals scrambling to keep up. His empire was not built on brute force alone. It was constructed through psychological mastery, strategic foresight, and the careful management of fear and loyalty. Yet, in the blink of an eye, that carefully balanced world began to unravel. The arrest was a stark reminder that no empire, no matter how meticulously constructed, is immune to the reach of the law, the treachery of allies, or the vulnerabilities inherent in human ambition. Luciano's downfall began with betrayal, the hidden fissures that had always existed within his carefully managed network. In the shadows of the streets he had once commanded, whispers of discontent and ambition circulated, quietly undermining his authority. Men who had pledged loyalty for years found opportunity in his absence, and those he had once protected now saw a chance to assert themselves. The delicate web of fear and respect that he had woven was not impervious. As law enforcement closed in, it became clear that some of the closest associates, bound by blood and business, were willing to trade the Don for their own survival. Betrayal was not dramatic or immediate. It was subtle, creeping into conversations, alliances, and business decisions, until the foundation of his empire began to tremble. The night of the arrest was emblematic of the collapse of power. Luciano, a man who had once walked through New York like a king surveying his domain, found himself at the mercy of forces he could not command. Law enforcement, having meticulously tracked his movements, descended with the precision of a military operation. The experience was a psychological shock. The streets that had once whispered his name in fear now bore witness to his restraint, his defiance, and ultimately his vulnerability. For the first time he confronted the reality that his physical presence, his most potent tool of control, could be rendered meaningless. The empire he had built did not protect him from confinement, and the carefully constructed illusions of invincibility were shattered. As news of his arrest spread, the underworld reacted with a mixture of fear, opportunism, and disbelief. For many, the arrest was a signal that the old order was vulnerable, that even the most powerful figures could be brought low by circumstance and betrayal. Allies scrambled to realign themselves, rivals began to make bold moves, and the intricate machinery of organized crime faltered under the weight of uncertainty. Luciano, once the axis around which the underworld revolved, became the subject of speculation, gossip, and strategic calculations. The streets that had once responded instantly to his command now moved unpredictably, and every decision, every relationship, became a test of survival for those who remained in his orbit. Psychologically, the arrest marked a turning point. For a man accustomed to control, dominance, and constant action, confinement was not merely a physical limitation. It was a challenge to identity. Luciano had thrived on immediate influence, on the ability to manipulate, intimidate, and negotiate in real time. In the stark silence of a cell, stripped of the trappings of power, he confronted the fragility of authority and the transient nature of control. This was a man who had mastered the complex dynamics of loyalty and fear, Yet here, in the hands of the law, he was reduced to observation and patience. The arrest forced him to engage with the world differently, to understand that influence could no longer be asserted through presence alone, but through strategy, timing, and the careful management of perception. The arrest also exposed the fragility of alliances. Those who had once deferred to him, who had pledged their loyalty without question, now faced moral and practical dilemmas. Cooperation with law enforcement, silence, or opportunistic betrayal became considerations that had previously been unthinkable. The psychological tension within the underworld intensified. Loyalty was tested, fear became a tool wielded in new ways, and the once unified empire began to fracture. This was the beginning of a slow-motion unraveling, one in which every decision, every act of betrayal or support, had far-reaching consequences for both Luciano and the criminal network he had painstakingly built. The public spectacle of the arrest further amplified its impact. Newspapers splashed his name and photograph across front pages, turning the Don into both a symbol of lawlessness and a cautionary tale. The media frenzy was unlike anything he had faced before. It was a theater in which power, reputation, and narrative collided. For the public, Luciano's arrest was both shocking and intoxicating, a story of hubris, genius, and the inevitable downfall of a man who had once seemed untouchable. For the criminal world, it was a lesson in vulnerability, a stark reminder that even the most powerful figures are subject to forces beyond their control. The arrest did not merely remove him from the streets. It redefined his role in the narrative of organized crime, shifting him from active dominator to object of observation, speculation, and strategic recalibration. Even as he faced confinement and legal scrutiny, Luciano's mind remained active. He began to calculate, to anticipate, to plan for the inevitable trials and consequences that lay ahead. In the quiet hours of incarceration, he reflected on the network he had built, the men who had betrayed or abandoned him, and the strategies that could still preserve his influence. The arrest, while devastating, did not extinguish his ambition. It merely transformed the battlefield. The streets of New York were no longer under his immediate control, but the empire he had created still depended on him, and he understood that influence could extend beyond walls, beyond surveillance, and beyond immediate presence. The arrest of Lucky Luciano, therefore, was more than a personal catastrophe. It was a turning point in the history of organized crime. It revealed the precarious balance of power, the inherent vulnerabilities of even the most sophisticated systems, and the profound psychological impact of losing authority. For Luciano, it was the first step on a journey of exile, adaptation, and reflection. A journey that would test his intellect, resilience, and understanding of human nature in ways that the streets of New York never could. In that moment of arrest, the Don confronted the limits of control, the inevitability of betrayal, and the beginning of a transformation that would define the final chapters of his extraordinary life. The courtroom became a stage unlike any Luciano had ever commanded, and in this theater the stakes were no longer measured in dollars, territory, or fear. They were measured in freedom, reputation, and the fragile perception of invincibility. For years he had maneuvered in the shadows, controlling the underworld with calculated precision, but now he was forced into the public eye, subjected to the scrutiny of judges, juries, and a voracious press. The trial was as much about narrative as it was about law. Every detail, from the testimonies of former associates to the strategic presentation of evidence, was weaponized to construct a story in which the omnipotent Don could be brought low. In the glare of the courtroom, power was stripped to its most basic components, and Luciano, accustomed to shaping outcomes through fear and loyalty, had to navigate a world where words, precedent, and public perception held the upper hand. The proceedings were meticulous, a prolonged battle that tested both intellect and resilience. Prosecutors sought to portray Luciano not merely as a criminal but as the orchestrator of a vast and intricate network of vice, corruption, and violence. They painted vivid portraits of speakeasies, clandestine gambling dens, and labor rackets, emphasizing the omnipresence of his influence and the systemic nature of his operations. Witnesses, some motivated by self-preservation and others by ambition, offered testimony that was often contradictory, yet collectively designed to erode the image of untouchable authority that Luciano had cultivated. The trial was an exercise in narrative warfare, where every word, gesture, and piece of evidence could tip the scales between freedom and a lifetime behind bars. Psychologically, the courtroom represented an entirely different battleground than the streets of New York. In the underworld, authority was enforced through presence, reputation, and the calibrated use of fear. In the court, authority was replaced by strategy, the ability to anticipate, the control of perception, and the mastery of language. Luciano had to adapt quickly, leveraging his intelligence and charisma to influence the jury and counter the meticulously constructed image of a criminal mastermind. Every response, every calculated pause, was a small act of power, a subtle attempt to assert control over a system designed to neutralize him. The courtroom was no longer a place of intimidation, but of psychological acuity, where victories were measured in persuasion rather than compliance. The media amplified every moment, transforming the trial into a spectacle consumed by the public. Newspapers splashed sensational headlines, framing Luciano as both a criminal genius and a cautionary tale of hubris. The press dissected the smallest details: the suits he wore, his demeanor on the stand, the tone of his voice, turning the Don into a symbol rather than a man. Public opinion became another arena of contestation, and Luciano, aware of the power of narrative, understood that perception could influence legal outcomes, social standing, and even the behavior of his criminal network outside the courtroom. The trial was as much about winning the story as winning the sentence, and every strategic decision had far-reaching consequences. Behind the legal maneuvering lay a network of allies and operatives, individuals who continued to manage his interests outside the walls of the courtroom. Letters, coded messages, and intermediaries became extensions of his influence, allowing him to maintain a shadow presence in the criminal world. This duality, of confinement within the courtroom and continued orchestration outside it, required a delicate balance of patience, timing, and trust. Luciano's genius was not diminished by physical limitations. It was transformed, evolving into a different kind of strategy that relied on foresight, psychological manipulation, and the subtle exertion of influence over men and events he could no longer command directly. The trial also laid bare the moral ambiguities that had always surrounded Luciano's rise. Prosecutors emphasized the human cost of his empire: lives destroyed, communities exploited, and violence perpetuated. Defense strategies, on the other hand, sought to contextualize his actions within a framework of survival, opportunity, and social marginalization. The courtroom became a space where morality, legality, and pragmatism collided, forcing both Luciano and the public to confront uncomfortable truths about power, ambition, and the choices that define human behavior. In this environment, Luciano's persona was tested not only as a criminal but as a man, with every gesture, word, and decision contributing to a layered portrait of brilliance, ruthlessness, and vulnerability. Ultimately, the trial marked a turning point in the perception of Luciano's empire. It was no longer an untouchable machine operating in the shadows. It was a human construct, subject to law, betrayal, and public scrutiny. The very systems he had designed to insulate himself from vulnerability were exposed to examination, their weaknesses highlighted by procedural rigor and the relentless pursuit of justice. Yet even in this crucible, Luciano demonstrated a remarkable capacity to adapt, to turn constraints into opportunities, and to continue shaping outcomes despite limitations. His mastery of strategy and psychology allowed him to navigate the trial with a calculated balance of defiance, composure, and tactical concession, preserving both his dignity and his influence. The trial also foreshadowed the exile that would define the next chapter of his life. The verdict, sentencing, and public scrutiny signaled the beginning of a profound transformation, a shift from active dominator of New York's underworld to a man whose power would have to be exercised at a distance, through subtlety, negotiation, and patience. It highlighted the fragility of even the most brilliant empires and underscored the limits of control when confronted by forces beyond immediate command. In the courtroom as outside, Luciano's genius lay not in invulnerability but in adaptation, the ability to observe, calculate, and influence, even when stripped of the familiar instruments of authority. Through the trial, the legend of Lucky Luciano was both challenged and cemented. To the public, he became a symbol of crime, ambition, and the consequences of overreach. To the underworld, he remained a strategist whose intellect could not be confined by walls or scrutiny. And to Luciano himself, the trial became a crucible in which the lessons of power, loyalty, betrayal, and resilience were sharpened, preparing him for the exile that awaited. It was a moment that transformed the man from an untouchable don into a figure confronting the limits of human agency, yet still possessed of a mind capable of shaping events, influence, and legacy from afar. Even behind the cold, unyielding walls of a prison, Lucky Luciano remained a man whose mind could not be confined. Physical freedom had been stripped from him, but the intricate web of influence he had constructed in New York remained alive, albeit fragile, and he understood that control could transcend walls if wielded with patience, cunning, and psychological insight. Prison was not merely a place of punishment. It became a laboratory for strategy, a space where the Dawn could observe human behavior in its rawest forms, recalibrate alliances, and maintain the subtle currents of authority that had always defined him. Every interaction with guards, fellow inmates, and visitors became a test of influence, a chess move in a larger game that extended far beyond the prison walls. From the moment he entered confinement, Luciano recognized that his survival and continued relevance depended on understanding the new dynamics of power. In the streets, authority had been exercised through immediate presence, intimidation, and the careful orchestration of fear. In prison, those instruments were limited. He could not issue commands with the same immediacy, and threats were often muted by the institution's rules. Yet he quickly adapted, relying on reputation, observation, and the psychology of human behavior to maintain control. The fear that had once been a tangible force on the streets became abstract, encoded in stories, rumors, and the perception of his reach. Even those unfamiliar with the full extent of his empire sensed that this man was not ordinary, that his influence could penetrate walls and traverse the strictures of incarceration. Luciano's interactions with fellow inmates were carefully calibrated. He observed behavior, measured loyalties, and subtly asserted authority without overt displays of violence. In doing so, he maintained a level of respect and deference, ensuring that his presence carried weight even in a space designed to neutralize power. Allies were identified, potential threats managed, and lines of communication established that would serve both immediate needs and long-term strategic goals. Every conversation, every gesture, and every decision was part of a broader psychological game, one in which he maintained the upper hand by understanding the vulnerabilities and ambitions of those around him. In this environment, he proved that intelligence, perception, and subtlety could wield power as effectively as guns and muscle. Outside the prison, Luciano continued to orchestrate elements of his empire with remarkable ingenuity. Letters were written in code, intermediaries deployed to relay instructions, and trusted operatives ensured that the machinery of the underworld continued to function. The empire he had built was not frozen by his incarceration. It required adaptation, delegation, and a keen understanding of human motivation. He understood that influence is as much about perception as action, and by cultivating an aura of presence and reach, he could ensure that decisions were made in alignment with his vision, even when he could not supervise them directly. This was a new form of power, one that tested his strategic intellect in ways the streets never had. The psychological toll of confinement was significant, yet Luciano turned it into a tool for self-reflection and planning. Isolation forced him to confront the vulnerabilities that had always existed alongside his brilliance: the reliance on fear, the fragility of alliances, and the inevitability of betrayal. Yet rather than succumbing to despair, he used this period to refine his understanding of human behavior, assess the loyalty of associates, and plan for eventual outcomes beyond the walls. Prison became both a crucible and a vantage point, offering insight into the resilience of his network and the ways in which influence could extend beyond immediate control. Even the limitations imposed upon him became instruments of strategy, shaping a more adaptive and patient approach to power. Luciano's continued influence behind bars was not only practical but symbolic. His ability to maintain authority and orchestrate operations despite confinement reinforced the perception of invincibility and strategic brilliance. Those on the outside, whether allies or rivals, understood that Luciano's mind remained the core of the empire, and his absence from the streets did not diminish his relevance. This duality, physical absence paired with psychological and strategic presence, became a hallmark of his post-power life. It demonstrated that true power is not merely exercised through direct control, but through perception, manipulation, and the subtle leveraging of relationships and human ambition. Moreover, prison provided Luciano with a unique perspective on the world he had once ruled. From within the walls, he observed the shifts in alliances, the rise of new players, and the vulnerabilities exposed by his absence. This perspective allowed him to anticipate moves, calculate risks, and maintain a degree of strategic oversight that few outside the prison would have imagined possible. He became a master of influence through distance, proving that even in captivity, a brilliant mind could shape events, mold outcomes, and command respect. The prison walls, intended to limit his power, instead became a proving ground for his adaptability, patience, and psychological acuity. Through it all, Luciano never lost sight of the inevitability of change. The streets, the alliances, and the empire he had built were in flux, yet he remained an active participant in shaping the narrative of his influence. Confinement had altered the methods but not the ambition. The tools had changed but the goal remained the same: to preserve power, maintain relevance, and ensure that the structures he had created continued to operate in alignment with his vision. His time behind bars, therefore, was not simply a period of punishment, but a continuation of his life as a strategist, a testament to the resilience, ingenuity, and adaptability that defined his extraordinary career. In the end, Luciano's ability to exercise power behind bars revealed a profound truth about human influence. True authority is not confined to physical presence, and the mind, when honed and disciplined, can reach beyond walls, beyond limitations, and beyond immediate circumstances. Even stripped of freedom, he remained a don in every sense of the word, his intellect and strategic acumen allowing him to navigate the constraints of captivity, preserve his empire, and set the stage for the next chapter of his life, one that would take him far from New York into exile, uncertainty, and a world where influence would require even greater subtlety, patience, and cunning. The moment Lucky Luciano was deported from the United States, the streets he once ruled felt emptier, quieter, yet paradoxically more chaotic. He had been the axis around which New York's underworld revolved, the man whose presence ensured that power, fear, and loyalty were meticulously balanced. But deportation was a different kind of punishment, one that stripped him not only of freedom but of the very territory that had legitimized his authority. No longer could he stride through Manhattan, issuing commands with the ease of a king surveying his realm. Instead, he was thrust into a foreign land, Italy, a place that carried his ancestry but not the empire he had built, a land that was at once familiar and alien. Here, the Don became a stranger in his own culture, forced to navigate a world where his reputation and influence had to be rebuilt from the ground up, and where survival required a different kind of intelligence than he had ever needed in New York. The streets of Naples, though brimming with life and color, could not replicate the intricate ecosystem of power Luciano had commanded in America. There were local criminal networks, hierarchies, and rivalries, but none operated on the scale, precision, or sophistication he had cultivated. The contrast was stark. The man who had orchestrated millions of dollars in illicit trade, who had redefined organized crime as a business, was now confronted with a society that neither feared him nor depended upon his vision. He had to confront a profound psychological reality. The empire he had built was tied inexorably to the streets, the culture, and the alliances of New York. Deprived of that ecosystem, he was forced to reevaluate not only his strategies but also the very nature of power itself. Authority, he realized, is as much about context as capability, and in exile, context had shifted dramatically. Deportation also brought a deep sense of isolation. In New York, even rivals knew that Luciano was untouchable, that his influence could reach across neighborhoods, families, and criminal enterprises. In Naples, he was just another man, recognizable, perhaps, but powerless in the immediate sense. He could not command fear with a glance, nor loyalty with a presence. Instead, he had to rely on intellect, patience, and subtle negotiation to carve out relevance. Every interaction became a test of psychological skill, understanding ambitions, leveraging connections, and managing the delicate balance between respect and caution. The exile's life required strategic thinking that was more abstract and long-term than the tactical decisions of street power. Luciano was learning to wield influence as a concept rather than a tangible force. Yet, despite the displacement, the deported Don retained the tools of his mind. Letters, intermediaries, and trusted confidants became his lifeline to the United States, allowing him to maintain a shadow of authority over the networks he had created. Even as he walked the streets of Naples, negotiating with local figures and assessing the landscape, he remained attuned to the movements of his empire across the Atlantic. Distance did not negate his influence, it transformed it. Every connection, every subtle suggestion, every carefully placed rumor could ripple through the criminal ecosystem of New York, reminding former allies and rivals alike that the Don's mind still held power, even when his body was far away. Exile was not merely punishment, it was a challenge to innovate, adapt, and exert subtle dominance in new ways. The deportation also forced Luciano to confront his personal identity beyond empire. In New York, power had defined him. His presence on the streets, in backrooms, and in the media had been the measure of his worth. Now, stripped of immediate authority, he had to explore the man behind the myth. Isolation became both a burden and an opportunity, a space to reflect on decisions, strategies, and alliances that had propelled him to power, as well as mistakes that had contributed to his downfall. In the unfamiliar streets of Naples, he observed people, systems, and opportunities with the keen eye of a strategist, noting patterns, vulnerabilities, and potential avenues for influence. The exile became a master of patience, understanding that power in this new world required subtlety, timing and psychological acumen rather than force or intimidation. Navigating life in Italy was complicated by cultural, political, and social differences. The criminal landscape was fragmented, less centralized, and often guided by different codes than those he had imposed in America. Luciano had to recalibrate his understanding of loyalty, negotiation, and influence. His reputation, once legendary, was insufficient alone. It had to be complemented by tangible actions that demonstrated capability and vision in a new environment. Every decision carried heightened significance, for mistakes in exile could isolate him entirely from opportunities to regain any semblance of authority. The stakes were psychological, strategic, and existential, a reminder that exile was not merely a legal penalty but a test of ingenuity, resilience, and adaptation. Despite these challenges, Luciano's exile did not mark the end of his ambition. Far from it, it became a period in which he refined the skills that had made him great. Distance forced him to think differently, to extend influence without presence, and to rely on intellect rather than force. He began to observe not only the criminal structures around him but also global shifts in politics, economics, and social networks, understanding that his future would depend on leveraging new realities rather than clinging solely to the empire of the past. Exile demanded vision, patience, and the courage to operate in uncertainty, all qualities that Luciano possessed in abundance. In the end, deportation was a paradox. It stripped him of his throne but preserved his mind, forcing the Don to confront the fragility and universality of power. For the first time, Luciano faced a world in which authority could not be asserted instantly, where loyalty was provisional, and where survival required adaptation rather than dominance. And yet, even in exile, the essence of the Don remained intact. A man whose intellect, strategic vision, and psychological mastery allowed him to navigate the unknown, to observe, to influence, and to plan. The streets of New York might have been out of reach, but the empire he had built lived on in reputation, in loyalty, and in the subtle manipulations of a mind that refused to surrender entirely to circumstance. Exile was not an end, it was a new beginning, a crucible in which the next chapter of his extraordinary life would be forged. Life in Naples was a landscape of contrasts for Lucky Luciano. On the one hand, it was familiar. The streets echoed with the cadence of Italian life, the smells of markets, the chatter of neighbors, and the rhythms of a culture he had known since childhood. Yet, on the other hand, it was alien. The city was not his empire, he was not its king. The power structures he had commanded in New York did not exist here, and every interaction, every negotiation, carried a weight that required patience, subtlety, and an acute understanding of human behavior. Where once authority was asserted by presence, reputation, and fear, he now had to operate largely through observation, discretion, and psychological maneuvering. The streets of Naples became a chessboard on which influence could only be exercised indirectly, through suggestion, alliances, and the careful cultivation of trust. Isolation defined much of his early experience. Removed from the constant hum of his American empire, Luciano was forced into a new rhythm of life, one in which time moved differently and power was less tangible. There were no speakeasies to manage, no unions to control, no immediate network of loyalists to command. Instead, he had to adapt to a slower, more measured pace, in which every decision required analysis, foresight, and a careful reading of the personalities around him. The exile's life was both mentally exhausting and intellectually stimulating. Every meeting, every casual conversation in the piazzas, was an opportunity to gather information, assess potential allies, and understand the shifting local dynamics. Power, he realized, could survive absence, but only when exercised through perception, influence, and reputation rather than direct action. Psychologically, the exile posed profound challenges. Luciano was a man whose identity had long been intertwined with dominance and control. The sudden removal from the streets he had mastered forced him to confront the fragility of authority and the impermanence of human loyalty. He wrestled with frustration, nostalgia, and the acute awareness of vulnerability. Yet, rather than succumb to despair, he turned his attention to adaptation. He observed patterns in human behavior, the nuances of Italian social structures, and the latent opportunities that might allow him to maintain relevance. The exile became, in a sense, a laboratory for psychological mastery, a space in which influence could be studied, honed, and deployed with patience and precision. Naples, with its labyrinthine streets, bustling markets, and tightly knit neighborhoods, provided a rich canvas for Luciano's observational skills. He watched how local figures exerted authority, how alliances formed and dissolved, and how reputation was both built and eroded. Unlike the American underworld, where fear could be leveraged with immediacy, Influence here required subtler strategies: persuasion, negotiation, and the cultivation of respect over time. Luciano approached each interaction as a study in human behavior, evaluating motives, testing loyalties, and calculating the potential outcomes of each engagement. Every gesture, every conversation, was an opportunity to assert presence, even in a city where he had no formal power. Despite the initial sense of alienation, Luciano began to rebuild a network of connections, albeit on a smaller and more nuanced scale. Trusted associates, intermediaries, and local figures became extensions of his influence. Letters, coded communications, and clandestine meetings allowed him to maintain a connection to the empire he had left behind in New York while simultaneously assessing opportunities within Italy. It was a delicate balancing act, maintaining credibility and authority abroad while navigating the unfamiliar terrain of Naples, where customs, expectations, and power dynamics differed from those he had mastered in America. The exile required him to operate on multiple levels simultaneously: observation, calculation, and subtle assertion of influence, all without the immediate enforcement mechanisms of fear or intimidation. The experience also deepened Luciano's psychological resilience. Isolation forced introspection, challenging him to reconcile the legend he had created with the man he was in exile. He reflected on past decisions, on the structure of his empire, and on the strategies that had ensured his rise. At the same time, he became acutely aware of the limits of influence, the fragility of loyalty, and the necessity of adaptability. This period of quiet observation allowed him to refine his understanding of human nature, developing insights that would later inform the subtle exertion of power from a distance. Exile, in this sense, was a crucible, transforming frustration into strategic acumen and displacement into opportunity. In Naples, Luciano also confronted the tension between nostalgia and pragmatism. Memories of New York, the streets, the nightclubs, the loyalists, and the battles won and lost, were constant companions. Yet, dwelling in the past was a luxury he could not afford. Survival, influence, and relevance demanded focus on the present, on understanding the dynamics around him, and on cultivating relationships that could yield future advantage. He became a patient observer of the unfolding social and criminal landscapes, understanding that time, reputation, and subtle manipulation could extend his reach even when physical presence was impossible. Every choice was deliberate, every interaction measured, and every rumor or suggestion calculated to preserve authority in a world that no longer recognized him as king. Through this period of exile, Luciano demonstrated that true power is not merely the ability to enforce commands but the ability to adapt, observe, and influence across distance, culture, and circumstance. Naples tested his intellect, patience, and psychological mastery, forcing him to engage with a world where traditional tools of control were ineffective. In doing so, he honed the skills that would allow him to remain a figure of influence, to maintain connections with the empire he had built, and to operate strategically in a context that demanded subtlety, foresight, and a deep understanding of human behavior. Isolation and observation became not punishments but instruments of adaptation, shaping the next phase of the Don's extraordinary life, in which power would be exercised not through fear or immediate presence, but through intelligence, calculation, and the art of perception. As the world descended into the chaos of World War II, Lucky Luciano found himself at a crossroads unlike any he had faced before. Exiled in Italy, he was far from the streets he had once commanded, yet he could not ignore the seismic shifts that were reshaping global politics, economies, and societies. The war brought both danger and opportunity, forcing Luciano to navigate a complex landscape where traditional notions of influence were intertwined with the movements of armies, governments, and clandestine operations. For a man whose life had been defined by strategy, foresight, and the careful orchestration of human behavior, this was a challenge that demanded both ingenuity and adaptability. The exile who had once relied on fear and loyalty to command power now had to understand the subtleties of international intrigue and the ways in which influence could extend beyond borders and conventional authority. The opportunity for redemption came in an unexpected form. American intelligence agencies, aware of Luciano's unparalleled network of contacts and intimate knowledge of the Italian port systems, recognized that he could serve a strategic purpose. His ability to influence dockworkers, smuggling routes, and criminal intermediaries presented a unique asset in the effort to secure Allied shipping against sabotage. In a dramatic inversion of his previous life, the man once hunted by the law was now approached by government operatives as a potential collaborator. This alliance was delicate and fraught with moral ambiguity. For Luciano, it was a chance to regain relevance and perhaps favor with the very powers that had exiled him, yet it was also a calculated risk requiring discretion, credibility, and the careful management of both perception and outcome. Luciano approached the arrangement with the same strategic mind that had guided his empire. He understood that cooperation with American authorities could enhance his position without necessarily undermining his autonomy or reputation within the criminal world. Letters and coded communications facilitated negotiations. Intermediaries were deployed to ensure accuracy, and every step was carefully measured to maintain leverage. The objective was clear: to leverage the opportunity presented by wartime exigencies to assert influence from exile, shaping outcomes in ways that benefited both the Allies and, ultimately, his own long-term position. In many ways, this period represented a new form of power, one exercised not through fear, violence, or territorial control, but through strategic negotiation, reputation, and the subtleties of alliance building. The role Luciano played in this unconventional arrangement was both operational and psychological. He advised on labor movements, the likelihood of sabotage, and the dynamics of local criminal networks that intersected with port activities. His insights were invaluable precisely because they combined empirical observation with an understanding of human behavior, motivation, and loyalty. Dockworkers, once the conduits of illicit trade under his American empire, could now be influenced to facilitate the secure movement of Allied shipping. In a sense, Luciano was applying the same principles of strategy he had used in New York, yet in a context that fused legality with pragmatism, and wartime necessity with long-term influence. The brilliance lay in adaptability. The skills that had made him a don in one world were now being translated into leverage in another, entirely unexpected environment. Psychologically, this period was transformative. Luciano was confronted with the paradox of power and morality. A man who had built his life on crime was now serving national interests, indirectly contributing to the survival of the very society that had expelled him. This alignment of personal and political benefit required careful navigation. He had to maintain credibility with American officials, ensuring that intelligence was actionable and reliable, while simultaneously preserving his reputation within the criminal world, where any appearance of weakness or compromise could be exploited. The tension between ethical ambiguity and strategic necessity highlighted Luciano's extraordinary psychological dexterity. He could operate in overlapping spheres of influence, where loyalty, perception, and action intersected in ways that demanded constant awareness and careful calculation. The wartime experience also reshaped Luciano's understanding of exile. For the first time since his deportation, he felt that distance did not entirely preclude influence. By leveraging information, relationships, and strategic acumen, he could affect outcomes on a scale that transcended his physical limitations. The war became a laboratory for testing the limits of indirect power, demonstrating that intelligence, observation, and subtle manipulation could rival, and at times surpass, the authority once exercised through physical presence. Even in a foreign country without formal control, Luciano's mind remained the instrument of influence, capable of shaping decisions, actions, and perceptions across continents. Moreover, this period illuminated the paradoxical interplay between crime and legitimacy. The same knowledge that had made Luciano a fugitive and a feared don now rendered him a strategic asset. His network of contacts, understanding of logistics, and psychological insight transformed him into a crucial intermediary, blurring the lines between illegality and national service. It was a moment of unexpected redemption. The exile who had been stripped of empire was now recognized as indispensable, albeit in a role that required discretion and the constant negotiation of risk. The irony was profound. A man who had lived by manipulation and fear was now enlisted to serve, not through coercion, but through the careful application of expertise and reputation. This period also reinforced a lesson that would define Luciano's later years. Power is resilient, adaptive, and multidimensional. It can survive exile, imprisonment, and even public condemnation if wielded with intelligence, subtlety, and foresight. The war illustrated that influence is not solely the product of presence or intimidation, but of strategy, information, and the ability to operate in complex, overlapping systems. Luciano's engagement with American authorities demonstrated that even those cast out from their primary spheres of power can find avenues to reassert relevance, shape outcomes, and maintain legacy, provided they possess the insight, patience, and audacity to act decisively within ambiguity. By the end of this wartime chapter, Luciano had regained a measure of relevance and respect, both abroad and, indirectly, in the United States. He had transformed the limitations of exile into an opportunity, leveraging his skills, reputation, and strategic intellect to operate on an international stage. It was a profound demonstration of resilience, adaptability, and the enduring power of psychological mastery. Even as the war raged and the world continued to shift unpredictably, the Don proved that influence is not merely about territory or physical control. It is about the mind, the ability to observe, predict, and manipulate outcomes, and the unwavering capacity to convert constraint into opportunity. In this extraordinary convergence of crime, war, and strategy, Luciano redefined what it meant to wield power from the shadows, setting the stage for the final chapters of his extraordinary life. The final decline of Lucky Luciano was not sudden. It was a slow, inexorable erosion of health, influence, and the illusions of invincibility that had defined his life. Years of relentless ambition, relentless calculation, and constant exposure to danger had taken their toll on both body and mind. Exile had forced him to operate in a world where physical presence was curtailed, yet even as he exercised influence from afar, the stresses of maintaining authority, negotiating alliances, and navigating the complex web of underworld relationships weighed heavily. Every decision carried consequences, every misstep could be exploited, and every moment reminded him that time, which had always been an ally in his strategic calculus, was now finite. The once unassailable Don now confronted vulnerabilities that no amount of cunning could entirely mitigate. Health, long overlooked in the pursuit of power, became an increasingly urgent concern. Years of indulgence, stress, and the constant psychological strain of leadership manifested in physical ailments, from chronic fatigue to more serious conditions that demanded attention. In the streets of New York, his vitality had been a tool, a presence that projected authority and inspired both fear and loyalty. In exile, without the immediate feedback of subordinates or the adrenaline of street battles, the decline was starkly visible. Physical weakness eroded not only his capacity for action but also the perception of power, reminding both allies and rivals that even legends are subject to human frailty. The Don's body, once a symbol of unyielding strength and endurance, became a reminder of mortality, a parallel to the empire he had lost and the passage of time that neither influence nor strategy could fully arrest. Betrayal, a constant companion throughout his life, resurfaced in subtle and insidious ways. The men who had once sworn loyalty were now confronted with opportunities, temptations, and ambitions that altered the balance of allegiance. Some sought to curry favor with American authorities, others attempted to capitalize on Luciano's absence to expand their own domains, and a few outright conspired against the structures he had established. In exile, the Don had to contend with information arriving through intermediaries, often filtered, incomplete, or manipulated. Trust, always the most fragile commodity in his world, became even more precarious, and the necessity of vigilance consumed mental energy. Each act of betrayal, whether overt or covert, underscored the fragility of empires built on human ambition and illuminated the limitations of influence without immediate enforcement. The psychological dimension of decline was profound. For a man who had long thrived on control, visibility, and the orchestration of fear and loyalty, the slow erosion of power was a confrontation with identity. Luciano had defined himself through action, command, and strategic genius, and as opportunities to exert influence waned, he was forced to grapple with existential questions. Who was he without the empire, the fear, and the immediacy of control? Reflection became unavoidable. He examined past alliances, decisions, and betrayals with a critical eye, discerning lessons that had been obscured in the pursuit of ambition. The decline was both a reckoning and a classroom, a period in which the Don's psychological acuity became essential not merely for survival, but for understanding the contours of power, loyalty, and human behavior in the twilight of life. Even as decline set in, Luciano remained intellectually active. Exile and illness did not silence his mind, rather they reshaped it. Strategic thought, negotiation, and the careful orchestration of influence became exercises in abstraction. He observed from a distance, assessed patterns of loyalty and ambition, and leveraged relationships with subtlety and precision. While physical authority had diminished, psychological influence persisted. Every interaction, every suggestion, and every carefully managed rumor served as a conduit through which the Don could maintain relevance, reminding allies and rivals alike that the mind remained a potent instrument of power. Decline in this sense did not eradicate capability, it transformed it, demanding a mastery of patience, observation, and indirect action. The decline was accompanied by increasing reflection on morality and legacy. Years of crime, betrayal, and ruthless ambition prompted deep introspection. Luciano considered not only the lives affected by his empire but also the broader implications of power, loyalty, and the human cost of ambition. In private moments, he wrestled with the tension between his achievements and the methods employed to secure them. This psychological reckoning was inseparable from the material and political realities of exile, the diminishing control over his former empire, the fragility of alliances, and the relentless march of time that placed limits on influence. Reflection became a necessary companion to decline, a lens through which to assess both the past and the potential for continued relevance despite physical and circumstantial constraints. Health, betrayal, and reflection intersected in ways that reshaped both action and perception. Allies, observing weakness, adapted their own behavior, rivals exploited openings, and Luciano himself became acutely aware of the necessity of measured decision-making. The decline of the body demanded compensatory reliance on intellect and strategy. Every communication, every calculated engagement, and every subtle exertion of influence had to account for diminished vitality and the constraints imposed by distance and circumstance. In this environment, the genius of Luciano's mind became both his greatest asset and his primary weapon, proving that even as the body falters, intellect and strategic insight can extend influence far beyond physical presence. The final chapter of decline was also marked by a quiet resignation to the inevitability of mortality. Exile, illness, and betrayal illuminated the limits of power, the impermanence of loyalty, and the fleeting nature of control. Yet in this recognition lay a paradoxical strength. Luciano's capacity to continue shaping outcomes, managing perception, and exercising influence even as the world moved on without him. Decline, in this sense, was not a surrender but an adaptation, a period in which the Don confronted the ultimate human realities, time, mortality, and the enduring complexity of human ambition, while continuing to exert agency through intellect, observation, and the subtle orchestration of relationships. Ultimately, the final decline of Lucky Luciano was a convergence of physical vulnerability, fractured alliances, and psychological reflection. It revealed the limits of human power while simultaneously highlighting the resilience of strategic intelligence. Even in exile, even in frailty, and even amid betrayal, he remained a figure capable of influencing events, maintaining a measure of authority, and shaping the perception of those around him. The decline was both an ending and a testament. The body may weaken, empires may crumble, but the mind, when honed and disciplined, can extend influence, command respect, and ensure that a legacy endures long after the streets have fallen silent. In the twilight of his life, Luciano embodied the complex interplay of ambition, power, morality, and human fragility, a reminder that even the greatest figures are subject to time, circumstance, and the inevitability of change. The end of Lucky Luciano's life arrived quietly, a stark contrast to the storm of chaos, ambition, and influence that had defined his years. The man who had once walked the streets of New York as if the city were his private kingdom, who had commanded fear, loyalty, and respect with a glance, now faced mortality with a contemplative stillness. Exile, illness, and the gradual erosion of power had stripped away the immediacy of authority, leaving behind the essence of a man defined by intellect, strategy, and a complex morality. Death was no longer a distant abstraction or a theoretical possibility. It was imminent, and with it came the final reckoning of a life lived at the intersection of ambition, genius, and human fallibility. Even as his health declined, Luciano remained keenly aware of his legacy. He understood that myth and reality are often intertwined, and that history would remember not just the tangible acts of crime and empire building, but the psychological resonance of his life. The world outside continued to interpret his actions through the lens of legend. The brilliant strategist, the ruthless Don, the exile who had defied authority and manipulated circumstance. Yet within himself, Luciano confronted the more nuanced truths. The risks he had taken, the human cost of his decisions, and the complex interplay of loyalty, betrayal, and ambition that had defined every chapter of his life. In the stillness of his final years, he reflected on both his triumphs and his failures, aware that the measure of a man extends beyond empire and infamy to the enduring imprint of choices and consequences. As he approached death, the psychological landscape of Luciano's mind was intricate. He contemplated the empire he had built, the streets he had ruled, and the network of relationships he had orchestrated with unparalleled skill. Each connection, alliance, and rivalry played a role in a vast narrative of power, and even in his physical decline he continued to analyze outcomes and motivations with the precision of a master strategist. Mortality did not diminish his intellect. It sharpened it, offering perspective on both the impermanence of power and the enduring influence of reputation. To the public, he was a myth. To those who had known him intimately, he remained a figure of intelligence, ambition, and human complexity, navigating the final chapter with reflection and awareness. The environment surrounding Luciano's final days mirrored the paradoxes of his life. He was both a private individual confronting human vulnerability and a symbol larger than life, observed, analyzed, and remembered by those who had followed, feared, or idolized him. Friends, family, former associates, and even adversaries carried varying degrees of emotional and historical investment in his life. The narrative of his existence extended beyond personal experience into the collective memory of a society fascinated by power, crime, and the allure of the underworld. Death, in this context, was both a personal event and a public reckoning, the closing act in a story that had captured imagination and inspired reflection on the nature of ambition, morality, and human resilience. Even in the final hours, Luciano's mind remained active, observing, processing, and interpreting the dynamics around him. Conversations with trusted confidants were measured, deliberate, and reflective. Every interaction carried significance, whether in imparting wisdom, reinforcing relationships, or shaping perception. The Don's understanding of human behavior, refined over decades of observation, negotiation, and orchestration, allowed him to navigate the liminal space between life and death with dignity and strategic awareness. Mortality became another variable in the intricate calculus of influence, a reminder that even at the end, the human mind can assert subtle authority over circumstance and legacy. The legacy of Luciano is inseparable from the dualities that defined him: power and vulnerability, loyalty and betrayal, brilliance and ruthlessness. He had risen from the chaos of New York streets to create an empire grounded not in brute force alone but in intelligence, psychological insight, and the ability to orchestrate human behavior with precision. His life demonstrated the universality of ambition and the cost of influence, showing how genius can thrive alongside moral ambiguity and how strategy can extend beyond physical presence. Death, rather than negating his impact, crystallized it. The myth of Lucky Luciano endured, yet behind it remained the human complexities that had made his story compelling, instructive, and profoundly human. Even beyond the streets of New York and the exile of Naples, Luciano's influence persisted. Criminal networks he had shaped continued to operate, strategies he had pioneered became templates for organized crime across the globe, and the psychological principles he had employed, the calibration of loyalty, the leverage of fear, the manipulation of perception, endured as lessons in power. His life became a study in the interplay between intellect and circumstance, between action and consequence, illustrating that the most enduring forms of influence are often abstract, relational, and psychological rather than immediate or material. Death, in this sense, was a transition from active authority to enduring legacy, a transformation from mortal strategist to a mortal symbol. The final reflection on Luciano's life is inseparable from the human tension that underlies all stories of power: the paradox of mortality confronting ambition, the fragility of alliances, and the inevitable reckoning with consequences. His death marked the end of active engagement, but it also solidified the lessons of his existence: that influence can transcend presence, that intellect can rival physical authority, and that legacy is constructed as much by perception and narrative as by tangible action. In the quiet of his final moments, away from the headlines, the rivalries, and the empire, Lucky Luciano faced mortality as he had faced every challenge, with awareness, calculation, and a mind attuned to the subtleties of human behavior and the complexities of power. Ultimately, the death of Lucky Luciano is more than the cessation of a life. It is the convergence of myth and reality, the endpoint of a journey that traversed streets, prisons, wars, and exile. It is a reminder that even the most formidable figures are mortal, that influence can endure beyond presence, and that the human mind is capable of extending power, insight, and legacy into realms untouched by physical constraint. Luciano's final chapter reflects the entirety of his extraordinary life, a narrative of brilliance, ruthlessness, adaptation, and reflection, leaving behind a story that continues to captivate, educate, and illuminate the intricate interplay of ambition, morality, and human complexity. The legacy of Lucky Luciano is one of paradox and complexity, a blend of innovation, ruthlessness, and psychological mastery that continues to reverberate long after his death. He was not merely a man who built an empire of crime. He was a strategist whose understanding of human behavior, organizational dynamics, and the subtleties of influence transformed the underworld from a chaotic collection of gangs into a structured, highly efficient enterprise. His genius lay not in brute force alone but in the orchestration of relationships, the cultivation of loyalty, and the manipulation of perception. These principles became the blueprint for organized crime worldwide, demonstrating that the most enduring forms of power are rooted in intellect, strategy, and the subtle exercise of psychological authority rather than mere violence or intimidation. Luciano's innovations fundamentally reshaped the American Mafia. By creating the Commission, a governing body designed to mediate disputes and coordinate operations among families, he imposed a system of checks, balances, and rules that allowed the organization to operate with unprecedented cohesion. This structural ingenuity reflected a deep understanding of both human ambition and the necessity of order in maintaining long-term influence. Whereas previous leaders had relied on fear, violence, or brute control, Luciano introduced a model that balanced authority with negotiation, foresight, and the strategic delegation of power. In doing so, he transformed organized crime into a form of enterprise, governed by principles as much as by muscle, and ensured that the foundations he laid would endure far beyond his lifetime. The psychological dimensions of his legacy are equally profound. Luciano's life illustrates how influence can be cultivated and sustained even when physical presence is absent. His ability to orchestrate networks from prison or exile demonstrated that power is not solely about visibility or direct action but about perception, relationships, and the calculated deployment of strategic insight. Future generations of criminals, strategists, and even observers of organizational behavior could study his methods to understand how to navigate complex social hierarchies, leverage alliances, and manipulate outcomes without relying exclusively on force. Luciano exemplified the principle that control over human behavior, the understanding of ambition, fear, and loyalty, is the ultimate currency of power. Moreover, Luciano's story highlights the interplay between morality, legality, and pragmatism. The same skills that enabled him to build a criminal empire also made him a strategic asset during World War II, demonstrating that adaptability, intelligence, and the capacity to operate across diverse contexts are essential to enduring influence. His ability to navigate ambiguity, negotiate alliances with entities that were simultaneously adversarial and cooperative, and apply his knowledge in both legal and illicit spheres underscored the versatility of strategic thinking. Legacy in this sense is not merely the continuation of empire or notoriety, but the enduring applicability of principles, methods, and insight across contexts, demonstrating that Luciano's influence extended far beyond the boundaries of crime alone. The cultural and symbolic dimensions of Luciano's legacy are equally significant. He became a mythic figure, a symbol of power, ambition, and cunning, whose story continues to captivate imaginations in film, literature, and media. The mythos surrounding him is inseparable from the reality of his life, reflecting the human fascination with individuals who operate at the intersection of brilliance, audacity, and moral ambiguity. Yet beyond the legend lies a tangible set of lessons about human behavior, strategic thinking, and organizational management. Luciano's life serves as a cautionary tale, a guide to ambition, and a testament to the enduring power of intellect applied with precision, even in the morally gray realms of crime and influence. The enduring influence of Luciano is also evident in the ways criminal organizations around the world have adopted his methods. Hierarchical structures, codified rules, dispute resolution mechanisms, and sophisticated coordination strategies trace their lineage back to his innovations. Beyond structural influence, the psychological tactics he employed, the careful balance of fear, respect, and loyalty, continue to inform contemporary approaches to power in both illicit and legitimate organizations. His ability to manipulate perception, anticipate rival moves, and adapt strategies to changing circumstances demonstrates that the principles underpinning his influence are universal, transcending time, geography, and legal boundaries. Luciano's life illustrates that the architecture of power is as much about cognition, foresight, and relational dynamics as it is about tangible resources or immediate control. Luciano's legacy also extends to the lessons it offers about human resilience and adaptability. His career encompassed rises and falls, exile and reinvention, imprisonment and strategic collaboration, yet through each challenge he demonstrated the capacity to survive, adapt, and remain relevant. Even in the most constrained circumstances, he leveraged intellect, observation, and subtle influence to maintain authority and shape outcomes. These qualities are not merely criminal strategies but universal lessons in leadership, problem-solving, and psychological insight. The enduring fascination with Luciano is not only about the crimes he committed but about the demonstration of human ingenuity, adaptability, and the nuanced understanding of complex social systems. At its core, the legacy of Lucky Luciano is a story of duality. Power intertwined with vulnerability, genius paired with ruthlessness, and strategy existing alongside moral ambiguity. His life offers insights into the mechanisms of authority, the the psychology of influence, and the enduring consequences of choices in high-stakes environments. The empire he built, the methods he employed, and the mythos he inspired have left an indelible mark on both organized crime and the cultural imagination. His story serves as a reminder that legacy is not merely about the power one wields in the moment but about the enduring structures, strategies, and narratives that continue to influence thought, behavior, and society long after the individual has passed from the stage of history. Ultimately, the enduring influence of Luciano transcends the specifics of crime and empire. It is a testament to the power of intellect, the importance of psychological insight, and the enduring capacity of human ingenuity to adapt, survive, and shape the world. Even as his physical presence faded, the principles he embodied, strategic vision, calculated influence, and a deep understanding of human behavior, persisted, demonstrating that true legacy lies in the ability to transform knowledge into enduring structures, influence, and lessons that continue to resonate across generations. Lucky Luciano's life, therefore, is both a historical account and a masterclass in strategy, human behavior, and the complexities of power that remain instructive and compelling to this day. In the final analysis, the life of Lucky Luciano stands as a testament to the complex interplay of ambition, power, and human psychology. He was a man who rose from the squalor and chaos of New York streets to construct an empire of unparalleled organization, strategy, and influence. Yet even as he commanded fear, loyalty, and respect, he remained vulnerable to the immutable forces of mortality, betrayal, and exile. His story is not simply one of crime and notoriety, it is a narrative of human ingenuity, adaptability, and the relentless pursuit of control in a world defined by uncertainty. Through triumphs and defeats, his life illuminates how intellect, observation, and psychological insight can extend authority far beyond the immediate reach of physical presence. Luciano's myth has always loomed larger than the man himself. In popular imagination, he is the archetype of the brilliant, ruthless Don, the master strategist who outmaneuvered rivals, reorganized the Mafia, and shaped the trajectory of organized crime for generations. Yet behind the myth lies the human reality of a man constantly negotiating between ambition and survival, loyalty and betrayal, innovation and the harsh consequences of a life lived at the margins of legality. Understanding Luciano requires a dual perspective. One that appreciates the legend and the structural genius he embodied, and another that acknowledges the psychological complexity, the vulnerabilities and the moral ambiguities that defined his existence. The measure of Luciano's life is perhaps most clearly seen in the way he navigated extremes. He balanced chaos with order, fear with respect, and power with subtlety. His rise illustrates the transformative potential of intellect applied to human networks, while his exile and decline reveal the fragility of even the most formidable authority. He operated simultaneously as a master of logistics, strategy, and psychology, demonstrating that influence is not merely a product of presence but of perception, planning, and the ability to anticipate and manipulate the behavior of others. His story provides a blueprint for understanding power in its multifaceted forms, highlighting the interdependence of intellect, charisma, and strategic foresight in achieving enduring impact. Even in exile, Luciano demonstrated that power can survive distance and adversity when exercised with subtlety and intelligence. By leveraging knowledge, relationships, and reputation, he remained relevant across continents, influencing outcomes from afar and redefining the nature of authority. The interplay between crime, legitimacy, and global events during World War II exemplifies this capacity, showing that adaptability and psychological insight can extend influence in unexpected ways. Luciano's life reveals that the boundaries between legality and illegality, failure and opportunity, weakness and strength are often fluid, navigable through skill, foresight, and strategic action. The narrative of Luciano's life also underscores the role of legacy in human ambition. Empires may fall, health may fail, and reputation may be challenged, but the structures, methods, and psychological principles he developed endured long after his death. He transformed organized crime into a system of governance, negotiation, and strategic enterprise, leaving behind lessons in human behavior, loyalty, and organizational management that transcend the specifics of crime. His life invites reflection on the enduring impact of intellect applied with precision, the capacity to shape events beyond immediate control, and the ways in which individuals can create enduring influence even in morally ambiguous contexts. Ultimately, the story of Lucky Luciano is a meditation on the tension between myth and reality, ambition and consequence, intellect and mortality. It demonstrates that the greatest figures are not defined solely by the power they wield but by the strategies, insights, and legacies they leave behind. Luciano's life embodies the paradox of human endeavor, the pursuit of dominance tempered by vulnerability, the exercise of brilliance shadowed by ethical ambiguity, and the creation of enduring influence in a world where circumstance, chance, and human behavior continually reshape outcomes. His journey from streetwise immigrant to legendary don, from exile to strategist, and from myth to enduring symbol provides a lens through which to understand the complex dynamics of power, human psychology, and the measure of ambition. As the narrative closes, it becomes evident that Luciano's true legacy lies not in the violence, crime, or notoriety that often dominate popular imagination, but in the enduring lessons of strategy, observation, and adaptability. He exemplified the capacity of the human mind to navigate complex social systems, to wield influence through intellect and perception, and to leave a lasting imprint on both structures and stories. His life, with all its contradictions, victories, and vulnerabilities, offers insight into the universal dynamics of human ambition, the exercise of power, and the enduring tension between myth and man. In reflecting on Luciano, we confront the full spectrum of what it means to wield influence, to rise, to fall, to adapt, and ultimately, to leave a legacy that transcends time, geography, and circumstance. Lucky Luciano's story concludes as a study in contrast, between the empire he controlled and the exile he endured, between fear he inspired and the vulnerability he faced, between the myth that endures and the man who lived in its shadow. In this duality lies the enduring fascination of his life, a narrative that is at once cinematic, psychological, and historically rich. It is a reminder that power, strategy, and human ingenuity are intertwined with mortality, moral ambiguity, and the relentless unpredictability of life itself. Luciano's life, observed in its totality, offers not only a portrait of a legendary don but also a reflection on the universal dynamics of ambition, resilience, and the ways in which a single individual can shape the world long after the final chapter has been written. Even after death, Lucky Luciano's influence continued to ripple through both organized crime and the broader cultural imagination. The structures he had established in the American Mafia endured, proving that the blueprint he had crafted was far more resilient than the individuals who initially implemented it. Families that once squabbled over turf and profit now operated under the Commission, a governing body designed to mediate disputes, regulate activity, and enforce order, a direct testament to Luciano's vision of a businesslike, strategic underworld. His innovations in hierarchy, negotiation, and coordination became the foundation upon which subsequent generations built, ensuring that the principles he developed would persist long after his physical presence had faded. This was a form of immortality, one rooted not in legend alone, but in practical, structural impact. The psychological legacy of Luciano was equally profound. He had demonstrated that influence could be wielded without immediate proximity, that reputation and perception could serve as powerful tools of control, and that strategic insight could compensate for physical absence or vulnerability. His life provided a masterclass in human behavior, revealing how fear, respect, loyalty, and ambition could be balanced and manipulated to maintain authority. Future leaders, both within organized crime and in other spheres of influence, would study these lessons, whether consciously or intuitively, recognizing the enduring power of intellect applied with precision. Luciano's genius lay not simply in his ability to dominate, but in his understanding of the subtleties that govern human interaction and organizational dynamics. Culturally, Luciano became a mythic figure whose life inspired fascination, fear, and admiration in equal measure. Films, books, and media portrayals cast him as the archetype of the brilliant, calculating don, a man whose intelligence, audacity, and ruthlessness elevated him above the ordinary criminal. Yet behind the myth was a human being who had navigated immense challenges, faced betrayal, and grappled with mortality. The tension between myth and reality, between legend and the man, is central to understanding his enduring appeal. Audiences are drawn not merely to his crimes, but to the demonstration of human strategy, resilience, and psychological acuity that defined his life. In this way, Luciano's story transcends the specifics of organized crime, offering insight into ambition, power, and human behavior that resonates universally. The interplay of morality and pragmatism in Luciano's legacy is striking. While he operated in realms of illegality, his methods displayed a level of sophistication, strategic thinking, and adaptability that commands a form of respect. His ability to leverage networks, navigate alliances, and manipulate perception allowed him to survive exile, imprisonment, and constant threats to his authority. These strategies reveal lessons about the universality of influence, showing that intelligence, foresight, and psychological insight can be as decisive as physical force. Luciano's life illustrates the complex calculus of decision-making in high-stakes environments, where loyalty is fragile, ambition is relentless, and the consequences of misjudgment can be fatal. The endurance of Luciano's influence also highlights the paradox of criminal legacy. Even those condemned by society can leave structures, strategies, and principles that outlast their mortal lives. His ability to create systems of governance within the Mafia, establish norms for negotiation and dispute resolution, and codify the psychology of loyalty and respect has left a blueprint that continues to inform criminal networks globally. Beyond crime, these lessons resonate in broader human contexts. Leadership, organizational strategy, and conflict resolution all reflect elements of the methods Luciano pioneered. His legacy is not confined to infamy. It extends into the study of influence, authority, and the mechanics of human behavior under conditions of pressure, risk, and opportunity. Even as the years passed, Luciano's name remains synonymous with power, cunning, and strategic brilliance. Generations of criminals, law enforcement officials, historians, and cultural commentators studied his methods, extracted lessons, and debated the ethical dimensions of his choices. His life became a prism through which to examine ambition, morality, and the enduring tension between order and chaos. By analyzing his decisions, successes, and failures, one can trace the evolution of the Mafia as an institution and understand the ways in which intelligence, strategy, and adaptability can shape outcomes in complex systems. Luciano's legacy is both a cautionary tale and a blueprint for influence, illustrating how enduring structures arise from both vision and ruthless pragmatism. Luciano's enduring relevance also lies in the contradictions that defined him. He was both ruthless and pragmatic, brilliant and morally ambiguous, feared yet respected. These dualities make his life a rich study for those interested in the psychology of power. The ability to balance these tensions, to command fear while cultivating loyalty, to exert authority while maintaining flexibility, to plan decades ahead while reacting to immediate threats, defines what it means to wield influence effectively. Luciano's life demonstrates that power is not static. It is dynamic, adaptive, and often dependent on the subtle management of perception, reputation, and human behavior. The principles he exemplified continue to inform not only criminal enterprises but broader reflections on leadership, negotiation, and strategy. Ultimately, the lasting impact of Lucky Luciano transcends both the streets he once ruled and the criminal networks he shaped. It lies in the enduring interplay between intellect, strategy, and human behavior that his life so vividly demonstrates. His structures persisted, his psychological insights remained relevant, and the mythos that grew around him ensured that his name would be remembered long after the final echoes of gunfire, sirens, and political machinations faded. Luciano's life, both extraordinary and deeply human, offers lessons about resilience, adaptability, and the multifaceted nature of power. Even in death, the Don's influence endured, a testament to the ability of strategy, intellect, and psychological mastery to create legacies that defy mortality. The city seems quieter now, but in truth nothing has calmed. Everything has simply gone underground. The men who once walked the streets with swagger now move like shadows, speaking in whispers, meeting behind tinted windows and locked doors. The air carries a strange tension, the kind that feels like a storm building behind a cloudless sky. Every conversation comes with double meanings, every handshake hides a blade. No one trusts the smile of another man anymore. No one believes a promise unless it comes with a threat. Even the places that once felt safe, bars, corners, cafes, now feel haunted by the weight of unspoken betrayal. It is as if the whole world has learned to hold its breath. And in that silence, the truth becomes clear. Survival here is not about strength or loyalty alone. It is about sensing danger before it arrives and moving before anyone notices you've disappeared.